We've got Danny Ryan from the Ethereum Foundation and Mr. Joe Lubin, co-founder of Ethereum and CEO of Consensus, my former boss for a very brief period of time in Q4 of 2017, the craziest time to be at Consensus and in Ethereum. Welcome, Joe and Danny, with Sebastian moderating. Thank you guys for joining us. Sebastian, all yours, man. Be gentle.
Hi, so I'm super excited to be here, and what a great job. I mean, I just want to congratulate the Messari team for putting on this conference. It is absolutely phenomenal, just the production value of this whole setup. I'm like totally geeking out here in the StreamYard. But enough of that. I want to introduce our panelists, fellow fireside chatters today for this Ethereum 2.0 update talk. So Joe Lubin, CEO of Consensus, and Danny Ryan of the Ethereum Foundation, and we're going to get right into it. So Danny, you wrote a monster blog post that you released today, and I just read it before this session. It's huge. It's like 4,500 words or something, and I think
it was a brain dump. People keep asking me the same questions, and so clearly there's an information asymmetry. So I just needed to get it out there.
Well, I think it's a great starting point or a great launch point for this session. Let's maybe start with, at a high level, why do we need Ethereum 2.0, and why is it so important today?
I can start that off. Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you look back at even some of the early writings about Ethereum, there was kind of this acknowledgement that, we need to get something out. We need to experiment with decentralized technologies and programmable and extensible decentralized technologies, but that the path to get to a global scalable infrastructure needed to start even back then. I mean, if you look at some of the early research in 2014, Vitalik's talking about sharding and proof of stake and those being kind of requisite paths to get us to where we want to go. And we've had a hell of a time with Ethereum since the launch. And people are building some incredible stuff on there. But to reach the scale and capacity to be the backbone of the new decentralized internet, we need to make some structural changes and structural upgrades. So that's, I think this became part of the public consciousness and the public discussion during the CryptoKitties incident when the chain first got kind of bogged down with a lot of activity. But this has been a long-term research project and engineering project now for many, many years.
Yeah, so hi guys, good to see you both. So in a sense, it was always about building something massively scalable. And we can call that Ethereum 2 or continually extending Ethereum. We knew actually in about the first week of really organizing the project, we started talking about sharding. We knew that what we were doing was going to be very difficult in some segments of the ecosystem back then. It was called impossible by many, that it would be too complicated to build something like that and keep all the nodes in sync, or building multiple clients would be too difficult to keep them in sync. But it was always about building, I know the narratives are multiple at this point, but it was always about building something that could be akin to a world computer that had pretty massive scalability. And there was thinking early on that it would be multi-layered, hierarchical in some senses. And so why build Ethereum 2? It's because we need scalability. We need much greater decentralization with the proof of stake consensus mechanism. The barriers to entry are much lower, so that many more people can participate as validators rather than having to make pretty big investments and seeing big miners have efficiencies of scale, which reduces decentralization and sort of creates an arms race. And so it's about building a trust foundation for the planet, and massive decentralization is necessary for that.
Well, there's lots to unpack here, and we're going to get to each of these points. But let's maybe, for our listeners, and there's about 300 people in here right now, let's get a refresh of where we are in terms. Well, what are the phases of my transitioning from Ethereum 1.0 to Ethereum 2.0, and where we're at in that roadmap?
Mike, why don't you lay out the landscape, Danny, and I'll see if I can add a little color.
Yeah, cool. So I say this time and time again, what ETH2 is really a highly scalable, decentralized proof of stake infrastructure. And what we have today is a single chain, and that consensus mechanism is like a relatively simple thing. That's one of the beauties of proof of work, is that it is relatively simple because the complexity is handled in this kind of extra protocol piece of hardware. But ETH2 is really a swap of that proof of work mechanism for a highly scalable proof of stake mechanism. Highly scalable in the sense that the existing Ethereum chain can sit underneath and inside of this consensus and be built by this consensus, but many additional chains can also be built in parallel under the same consensus mechanism, facilitating communication and kind of general singular structure. Where we are today is that it's divided in a few phases. Phase 0 is the construction of the core system, really the core of this consensus mechanism called the beacon chain. It handles up hundreds of thousands of validators, tens of thousands of nodes distributed across the world, and can come to consensus in a very secure manner. The next phase is layering in a number of shards to live under this consensus mechanism. This is called a phase 1, at which point we expect to have a data availability of the entire system in the 1 to 4 megabytes per second range. This is a lot of data, and you can actually do a lot of really cool stuff with this layer 1 data availability. And then soon after that is the unification and the integration of existing Ethereum mainnet into this new consensus mechanism. So until then, Ethereum keeps chugging along under the proof of work mechanism. But once we've architected this new cradle essentially for it to sit inside of, that's at which point we expect to migrate into the ETH2 consensus mechanism, a migration that we expect to be largely transparent to existing Ethereum mainnet. At that point, there's a lot of, there's enhanced security, there's this enhanced data availability layer and some other fun stuff that developers will begin to access and leverage. But there's also what we call a phase 2 beyond this merger, at which point we add additional state and execution to all of these other shard chains, or a number of those shard chains that until that point were just data. So you can imagine, rather than just the existing single chain paradigm of Ethereum today, you have multiple of these chains living in parallel to each other under the same protocol and secured by the same protocol.
So where are we? We're at Ethereum 1, and Ethereum 1 is just crushing it right now. Ethereum 1 is seeing scalability in the form of hundreds and thousands of transactions per second being added at layer 2. We've got Starkware and Loopring and OMG and Matic Network scales coming online soon. So Ethereum 1 is becoming extremely usable at high transaction volumes, and the world is building the emerging decentralized financial plumbing on it. It's very young and immature still, but essentially in DeFi, the world is building open financial protocols that will enable anybody to access them, to build on them, and to essentially operate the machinery of the next generation decentralized financial system without requiring priests to mediate their access to the money gods. And we are building a scalability solution in the form of Ethereum 2 on a brand new technology, so unfettered by the constraints of the previous generation of technology, which is kind of unusual in technology. Usually you're constrained by the previous version of your technology. And so in a sense, there's this quantum leap happening, but in another sense, there's a very smooth transition happening. It's going to be very smooth for developers, and it's going to be very smooth for users, essentially because we're using Ethereum 1 as a platform to launch Ethereum 2. You can think of Ethereum 2 as almost being initially Ethereum 2 phase 0, the staking system, the beacon chain heartbeat system. You can think of it as being essentially a DeFi app on Ethereum 1, slotting in with a whole bunch of other DeFi apps. And we're using Ethereum 1 to launch Ethereum 2 phase 0. We will see things like, and there's a debate around the timing of this sort of thing, but the ability to move tokens around on Ethereum 2, the ability to move tokens back to Ethereum 1, the ability for Ethereum 2 to finalize blocks on Ethereum 1, reducing issuance of Ether. And so we're essentially building this system that will have tendrils back and forth between Ethereum 2 and Ethereum 1. When phase 1 launches, we'll have massive data availability layers in the form of the shards that Ethereum 1 applications can make use of, the layer 2 applications. And when Ethereum 2 launches, we're likely going to have an execution environment, probably the first one, that will enable Ethereum 2 to essentially onboard the state of Ethereum 1, to bring it on board and make Ethereum 1 just a subset of Ethereum 2. So the way for developers to think about it, and I like to steal this from Danny, is to think of it as an operating system upgrade where if you just build your app, it's going to continue to run unstopped, unchallenged on Ethereum 1, even as Ethereum 1 is absorbed into Ethereum 2. But if you want to make use of new features, if you want to avail yourself of cross-shard mechanisms in some of their applications potentially, then you can upgrade your application and take advantage of what Ethereum 2 brings.
Yeah, I think in our last conversation, you compared it to the universal apps in macOS from back in the day. Those will remember the upgrade from PowerPC to Intel, and I kind of like that analogy. I also like the idea that Ethereum 2 is a DeFi app on Ethereum 1. I've never really considered it that way, but I guess it becomes a subset. It starts as a subset of Ethereum 1 in a sense, and then Ethereum 1 becomes sort of a subset of Ethereum 2. Danny, in your blog post, you mentioned it here that Ethereum 2 will have scalability between 1 and 4 megabytes per second of data. And I'd never really heard of blockchain scalability in the terms of megabytes per second. We're usually talking about transactions per second. Just as just for comparison, how many megabytes or maybe kilobytes or even bytes per second are transaction volumes representing on Ethereum 1?
Ethereum 1's probably, in terms of megabytes per second of layer 1 data availability. I know that's kind of a strange thing to talk about, but it's a really, data availability is actually very hard in decentralized mechanisms. And when you scale them out, it's actually really easy to like scale them out and not consider data availability, but to actually have like provable, secure layer 1 data availability is like a very powerful and tough thing. We just kind of in a single chain paradigm, we just assume we're going to have the data because it's not that much data. Whereas when we bring a ton of the data under the same mechanism, we need to actually start architecting in such a way that we actually can make claims about the data actually being available. So anyway, so the current Ethereum block size, like data availability, current Ethereum probably provides something like a 1/100th of that. Okay. I think it varies depending on the gas limit because we're thinking usually more in terms of gas rather than in terms of the block size. But if you look at block sizes divided by 15 seconds, you get somewhere in the order of like 100th of what you might expect in ETH2. And I mentioned the data availability and the amount of layer 1 data available because there are a number of applications that actually increasingly so just leverage layer 1 data and specifically these roll-up technologies that in a lot of layer 2 mechanisms, data availability is really hard. You're like, okay, I can make this really scalable thing, but oh no, if I can't find the data, then the whole security mechanism can be broken. So in these rollup chains, they say they use the layer 1 data, the actual layer 1 block data, to leverage scalability. And so if we can provide a highly scalable data layer to rollup technologies, we can get massive scalability gains. So things like rollups, absolutely. Things like maybe a decentralized Twitter that just needs places to chuck data, and all that kind of stuff. Like layer 1 data, and I think increasingly so with the evolution of ETH2, is going to be used in a lot of decentralized applications. So yeah, that's. I realized yesterday, actually, in a conversation that this, as we were going over this blog post, that this notion of data availability is really not something we talk about a lot. We talk about a lot in like kind of core blockchain research, but we don't really talk about a lot in terms of how developers might think about it, what they might be able to do with it. So that's actually kind of one of the new things that I'm going to be trying to write about more, is to help explain to the public really like why we care about data availability.
Interesting. Well, we could stay in this very technical space for a long time, I think, but we only have like 15 minutes left. It's quite a short session. I do want to talk about something you mentioned, Joe, earlier, is the onboarding experience for developers, and I'd like to extend that to sort of broader user experience. How will Ethereum 2.0 change user experience for developers but also for users? I mean, outside of the sort of obvious scaling and ability to create massive amounts of transactions, what other kinds of use cases and applications does scaling make possible?
So I think the user experience is already being heavily addressed. Essentially, early generations of blockchain have scalability issues, privacy and confidentiality issues, in user interface or user experience issues. And we've learned just so much through repeated iteration of single applications or building different applications. There's a lot of focus on progressive security or progressive onboarding, so that you don't want to force users to jump through hoops before they can use your application. You want to enable them to hit your app at a URL and give them a wallet built into the browser. Not super high security, but as they invest more attention and more assets potentially, then you nudge them into taking greater control over their own assets and learning how to use the system. It's very similar to how Apple Computer, and back to the Apple analogies, how Apple Computer taught human beings how to use smartphones. If I gave my previous self from 15 years ago my current iPhone, it would seem just like a piece of magic. I wouldn't know how to swipe or pinch or etc. And so it's about a feedback loop, an interplay between the developers, the technology, and the users. And if you've got good devs, then they're listening. And so adding scalability to that, it will be interesting to see what dimensions that opens up for developers. I think developers are always really good at maxing out whatever they're given. I don't know the directions that, say, 5G is going to bring. I mean, we know that we'll be able to download movies instantly, but the kinds of next generation applications that will facilitate, rather than just sort of translating what we already know to the new capabilities, it'll be really interesting to see how different applications splayed across different shards or across whole completely different networks interoperate with one another. So it's essentially like re-architecting the financial world, the economic world, social, political worlds, and seeing how it all settles. So I think we will see the New Yorks and the Londons and the Hong Kongs. So the Hong Kong's having a tough time right now in terms of financial center. We'll see these new kinds of financial centers set themselves up where you need essentially high frequency access to different kinds of applications, and we'll see layers like different sort of cached layers where you need lower frequency access to different kinds of services.
Thanks. So I'd like to address proof of stake. Obviously, Ethereum 2.0 leverages proof of stake, and we'll be phasing out proof of work. So we talked earlier about Ethereum 2.0 being essentially a DeFi application of Ethereum 1.0. What does proof of stake in Ethereum mean for the future of the economy within Ethereum? And the question behind that is just how does that grow the DeFi? How does proof of stake grow the DeFi ecosystem essentially that already exists in Ethereum and is already quite mature?
You want that, Danny?
Yeah, sure. So there's a ton of things you can do with Ether today. ETH is money, ETH is collateral, ETH is pays transaction fees to use this network, and adding in proof of stake really just adds another thing that you can do with your ETH. You can seek returns. It has a certain risk profile, and it allows you to, which I think is important to a lot of our users, contribute to the network in a really meaningful way. And all of the things that you can do with your ETH have their own risk profile and their own, own potential for returns, their own potential for risks. And this is going to be another thing that people can consider doing with their Ether assets. And some people are worried about like competition between layer one and all these other applications. And I think it's going to be very appealing for much of our community to get involved in this. I think the risk profile is way different than using some sort of DeFi application, and so the returns thus are going to look a lot different. So it's a little wishy-washy, but it's just another additional thing that you can do with your collateral. But Joe, you might have something to add there.
Yeah. So mature commodities markets are highly granular, highly parallel, many thousands in many cases of different kinds of actors, all mostly competing with one another, but collaborating with one another according to certain protocols in different kinds of markets, on exchanges, at silos, etc. What we're seeing now is the granularization, financialization, tokenization of the global IT infrastructure, where things like trusted transactions on projects like Ethereum, decentralized storage, decentralized bandwidth, decentralized heavy compute, decentralized identity are all going to be these granular commodities that we can provision for, that we can acquire, that we can mine, that we can sell, and we are going to need financial infrastructure for all of that to hedge out our pricing risks, whether we're consumers or producers. So these systems are part of an evolution towards turning our planet into one just giant computation storage bandwidth ball, and having some of the major tokens as staked tokens. So Filecoin, Ether, a handful of others will bring this tokenization, this financialization intimately in line with governance. And so, financialization in the sense that you can build portfolios out of these things, but also the governance is going to be much more granular as well than the governance that we see in the physical world, which is not doing such a good job right now. We shouldn't have major nations governed by essentially two parties that represent 1% or less of the people effectively. What we should have are these network collectives where these tokens, whether they're the permissionless utility tokens or whether they're tokens for narrower purposes. They represent money or assets. They represent governance, and they enable people to define their goals, raise funds for it, and execute those goals, and achieve much more granular governance that serves more people.
Great. So is this a guitar moment, or
Who's
should I get
this guy?
should I get my guitar?
You know this guy, Sebastian?
Yeah,
How did he get in?
I saw your guitar in the background, and I wasn't sure maybe if we wanted to change things up. I think people.
I could also jazz it up with some piano.
Yeah, so that's the difference between
sing a
someone like
song?
me, who's just using it as a prop and plucking strings mechanically, and someone who's actually a musician. We are going to have to cut it off. I think, as with many of our sessions, this probably could have been an hour session just as easily as
2 hours. Easy.
So definitely appreciate you guys coming on, and hopefully Danny, Joe, and Sebastian, you'll have a chance to stick around the chat for a few minutes. There might be some folks that have questions within the Hopin interface. So thank you again.
Thanks, Joe. And Danny.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. And check out the blog post I wrote on the
Yes,
Ethereum blog today if you want to kind of get some more context around all this stuff.